Our top focus story, there will be no meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Hamburg. So there is no bilateral. The G20 is unlikely to see a political foundation. So this means that a political solution to the Doklam plateau incident is unlikely to come from G20, unlikely to have any directions coming from the head of state and government. Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi will not be meeting separately. They, of course, will be meeting as part of G20. They will be a part of deliberations. There were reports initially that Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping may meet on the sidelines of the G20 and a resolution of the current standoff may emerge. But China has now said that the time is not right for a Modi-Xi Jinping bilateral meet. This is also significant because both the leaders are considered very strong domestically. They face a constituency domestically, and any weakness would be detrimental to their careers. And I want to quickly cut across to India. Today's Anant Krishnan, who joins us live from Beijing for more on this. Anant, there was hope that there would be a political direction when President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi meet in Hamburg on the 7th and the 8th, but that now is not happening.
That seems very unlikely now, that's for sure, Gaurav. The Chinese Foreign Ministry saying, when asked very directly, in fact, India Today asked them today, is the meeting going to happen? And what the Foreign Ministry said was that as for the arrangement, China's view was that the political foundation of the relationship has been damaged by the Doklam incident. So in their view, any dialogue between India and China, the precondition was an immediate withdrawal of Indian troops. So China is sticking to that point, and it seems that, but China also saying that the BRICS informal leaders meeting will happen tomorrow, and Modi and Xi may be exchanging words before or after that meeting in an informal way. But we can report now that it's highly unlikely that a more formal delegation-level meeting will now be taking place, given the line China has taken, insisting on a precondition.
Okay, but there is a boundary dispute mechanism in place. And Anand, stay with me for a moment. We also have Colonel Pillai with me in the studio. He's somebody who studies China very closely. Colonel, there is a boundary mechanism system in place. In case of a dispute, the countries come to the negotiating table and then perhaps step back to reduce tensions. China is being belligerent here.
Absolutely, they're being belligerent and unreasonable. But the fact is that we must understand is that we are on the upper hand, morally as well as tactically. That ground that the Chinese are trying to build a road in, it doesn't belong to them. It's very clearly inside Bhutanese territory, and they clearly involved a third party here. So this issue of their belligerence is a pattern which they actually play out over some, preceding any major event.
Yes.
And so I don't think we just need to stick our neck out and hold out. That's it. I really don't see it turning into a major...
Colonel, stay with me for a moment. I also want to bring in Commodore Uday Bhaskar, Director, Society for Policy Studies, who joins us on the broadcast. Commodore Bhaskar, let's for the moment talk about what's happening at the Doklam Plateau. We'll subsequently come and talk about what's happening in the Indian Ocean region, something that you study very closely. But what do you make of China saying no meeting between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi because the political foundation has been damaged by India's actions?
I would characterize this, Gaurav, as a strengthening of the resolve of the Chinese government not to allow any kind of political mediation at this stage is being reiterated. So it's a hardening of the Chinese position in terms of whatever windows we had all been expecting, that as in the past, when there were other incidents that only were bilateral between India and China, you'll recall that we had the Depsang and we had Chumar and such standoffs, as it were. And after the situation went beyond the tactical level in terms of the army commanders on both sides, it moved from the diplomatic to the political dimension or domain, and that is where the resolution took place. So there was a fair amount of, I would say, expectation in India that Hamburg the G20 summit would provide that particular opportunity. And the statement by the Chinese foreign minister is unambiguous. So I would see this as a case of China digging its heels in.
Okay.
And I think from the Indian perspective, now we would have to, I think, also take a call about how India is going to also stand by its own position, because by that we have Bhutan, the affected party, and it is Bhutan's territorial integrity or the 1998 and agreement between Bhutan and China that is currently being violated. So this is a very, very distinctive, I would say, sui generis kind of territoriality issue, which involves a third country. And India is stepping in because of its own treaty obligations that go back to 1949 and subsequently when Bhutan became a democracy.
China, Commodore Bhaskar and Anant, if I could bring you in for a moment, China basically digging its heels in. It first is the aggressor, and then, Anant, it's the aggressor that's actually playing the victim role. So the bully is actually being the victim, playing the victim role, and at the same time threatening India day in and day out.
Well, Gaurav, it seems to be a kind of brinksmanship that we haven't seen India-China boundary issues in the past. They've usually been handled in a very sober manner by both governments, but it seems something is fundamentally different about this particular incident, the way China has been very publicly taking very strong stands, giving very little wiggle room for a compromise. And in fact, today China has also, besides playing down the likelihood of a meeting, Beijing also said that in their view it was India that altered the status quo, not China. India by entering into the Doklam. So China also saying that in their view it was India that is violating international relations, and that in their view India was liable for the current state of affairs. So it's a hardening of the stand, as Comrade Bhaskar rightly put it. So it remains to be seen how this de-escalation is going to take place, given that day by day all we're seeing is a hardening rather than a de-escalating.
Okay. So hardening of stance, but what should India do at this stage? Because Colonel Pillai, when you look at the situation on ground, China unilaterally changes the position on ground by coming into an area that's disputed between China and Bhutan. So it's changing the situation on ground despite 24 rounds of talks between Bhutan and China. Then when India steps in to protect Bhutan's interests, China forgets about Bhutan and then threatens India. And now it's China that's putting a condition that you either withdraw or face consequences, and shrill rhetoric coming whether from Chinese commentators, media, or to an extent even from their army and from their diplomats. So how do you read the situation? What should India do?
India has to hold firm. There is no compromise here for us at all. It's a question of our, the chicken neck that is there. It's a very narrow corridor that connects the whole of the northeast, and they're finding an access to that area. So there's no question. Firstly, morally we are on the right. Tactically we are on the superior position. So here Chinese are at fault. In fact, you must have, there was a recent video of a political councillor reaching out directly to the people, trying to explain their position. We're always trying to reach out and explain how they are right. It is clearly a clear state where India has to hold firm.
Yes.
And you would see that whenever we held firm, we stood eyeball to eyeball and looked into their eyes and said that we have no compromise, no retreat.
Yes.
They've chickened out.
Okay. So, must remember that. Commodore Bhaskar, is that the stance that India must take? We are morally right. We are factually right. In case there is an issue, it has to be discussed, not with this shrill war rhetoric that comes from China, and of course a very measured response from India. But India has to stand firm, because this is not just about India, it's about smaller countries in Asia, and especially in this instance, it is about Bhutan, a very dear friend of ours.
Yeah, I think, Gaurav, at this stage, perhaps it would be more prudent for India to also convey its own resolve, but preferably in a restrained and in a very, I would say, relatively subdued manner. The only reason I'm using the word subdued is because, as Colonel Pillai has pointed out, as far as the legality or even, quote-unquote, the rightness of the situation is concerned, India is definitely in a more advantageous position.
Yes.
Because the entry into this particular Doklam area is more about Bhutan.
Yes.
So, in the event any country has to, I think, raise its voice about China's current violation. It is Bhutan which had pointed this out in a press release fairly early on after June 16, saying that it is a treaty violation, agreement violation. So therefore, I think India should be discreet in terms of how it is projecting its support to Bhutan, not let this appear to be bilateral. And I think even in terms of how we are conducting our public discourse, I think we should not insist or force China.
India is very restrained so far. You're absolutely right, Commodore Bhaskar. Stay with me for a moment. I want to bring in Brinkmanship, one man who understands Chinese mindset very well and has been predicting China's bullying tactics very effectively. Brinkmanship, how do you see China making a statement that there will be no talks between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the sidelines of G20 on this issue?
That won't be a loss for India if China does not want to have a bilateral meeting on the sidelines of the G20 summit. It means that they do not want a negotiated end to the current standoff near the tri-junction where the borders of Bhutan, India and Tibet meet. In any case, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping will have an opportunity to meet during the BRICS meeting, which will be held on the sidelines of the G20 summit. But if they're not having a separate meeting on bilateral issues, it's no loss for India.
Okay, but Brinkmanship, there are many who say that this game of brinkmanship could actually lead to escalation, and could it, in your opinion, lead to perhaps a short, sharp conflict where the Chinese could try and take control of Indian territory?
What we're seeing now is an escalation in China's psychological warfare against India, including daily threats being bandied about. The idea is to pressure India and make it back down. But the fact is that there's a lot at stake for India, diplomatically and militarily. Militarily, if India were to back down, it would actually allow China to build a strategic highway through Doklam Plateau of Bhutan and create a serious military threat towards Chicken Neck in a future conflict.
Yes.
And diplomatically, if India were to back down, it would mean that Bhutan will have to relook at its current security arrangements with India. No longer would Bhutan be able to bank on India for its national defense in the future if India were to back down. As it is, as you know, China has already intruded into India's strategic space in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, in the Maldives.
Yes.
And it's trying to intrude into India's space in Bhutan. So if India were to back down, it will mean serious, irreparable damage to its diplomatic and military interests.
Absolutely. India backing down at this stage would be detrimental to India's national interest. Brinkmanship, stay with me for a moment. I want to continue talking to you about this in greater detail. Colonel Anil Kaul also joins me on the subject. Colonel Kaul, how do you look at Chinese threats of carrying out a military exercise, an armored corps brigade level exercise at an altitude of 16,800 feet? This is what the Chinese media has claimed.
Well, Gaurav, you will appreciate that we have moved an armored brigade in that area, and so the Chinese also want to say that what you can do, we can do it a little better. The only advantage they have is that they've got a flat piece of ground on their side, and we have to climb up to reach that flat piece of ground, because maneuvering tanks in the mountain is not done. It just can't be done. Therefore, they are probably trying to tell us that when you moved a brigade of tanks into this so-called 17 corps area, which is going to be the strike corps of the mountain strike corps, and one brigade in Ladakh, armored brigade in Ladakh, and one in the northeast. Well, they have obviously understood what our game is, and it's a good thing that we are keeping them on their toes. So maybe that this is what part of not backing down is all about.
Absolutely. Is that the message that India is also quietly sending out there's no question of backing down because India's national interests are at stake. What other nations in Asia think of us, that's at stake, and we have to protect Bhutan's interests because we are right. And is that the message that's actually going out, and that's making China very nervous, or is China unnerved by India's stance, and that's why these shrill provocative statements every day? Brahmachalani?
China very cleverly is playing the victim and putting the focus on India, but not Bhutan, even though the issue at stake involves Bhutanese territory. And there is a reason behind it. They don't want to focus on Bhutan because it will show China in unflattering light internationally. Asia's giant taking on and nibbling away at the territory of a tiny little state like Bhutan.
Yes.
So they are putting the spotlight on India. But India ought to put the spotlight on what China is doing with little Bhutan. Because that's the way the international community will wake up to what's happening, and that's how the international community will sympathize with the plight of tiny Bhutan. Right now, China is trying to make it a China-India issue and it's playing the victim. That kind of a narrative we need to undermine.
And that narrative, perhaps, Anant, if you're still with us from Beijing, that's the narrative. Usually, perhaps the impression would be that India will either buckle under Chinese pressure or Chinese propaganda about their being very superior. That would perhaps prevail. But this time, a spade is being called a spade. Anant, is that why we see these very, very shrill statements coming either in the Chinese media or, more disturbing, from the Chinese army and in some instances their diplomats?
That's right, Gaurav. I think Brahmachalani hits the nail on the head. Absolutely, what comes out and what they've been saying this past week, it's very interesting that there's hardly much of a mention of Bhutan. It's all about India. It's all about India altering the status quo and India doing this. And as Chalani says very correctly, that it's because they don't want to be seen. They don't want this to be seen as a China-Bhutan dispute, which it is, given that it looks like China is bullying a country of less than 8 lakh people. So the focus very much is to keep the public pressure on India and try and paint this as an issue that India has instigated. That seems to be their public approach. And as you also said, it seems to be risk, as you said, that they have miscalculated and are probably backing themselves into a corner by putting out these public statements. They're also narrowing the wiggle room for themselves, given that they have whipped up a storm in China. They have led the Chinese media, to give a lot of attention to this. So it remains to be seen how they're going to sort of disentangle themselves from this corner that they're backing themselves into.
Oh, absolutely. Commodore Uday Bhaskar, that's exactly the truth on ground. So here is a mighty China that's bullying a tiny Bhutan, physically, forcibly trying to take over their land. And when India steps in, China's so miffed that how can any other country stand up to China bullying a very small Bhutan? That's the reality on ground.
Yeah, you're right, Gaurav. That's the reality, and it began on the 16th of June. And I think one of the elements of the 21st century, intimidation through military means and otherwise, there is a ground rule, which came up, I would say, in the 1991 war for Kuwait, where apart from all the high technology and the actual movement of in a tactical sense,
yes,
it was also very important to win the story, or to have what might be called as domination.
Okay.
That your version of the story prevails as far as the global committee or international empathy is concerned.
Yes.
This is something that I would make a case that China has internalized over the last 20-25 years. And therefore, if you were to reconstruct the trajectory of the Doklam incident from June 16th,
yes,
to where we are now, July 7th, G20 is perhaps now the most important high-visibility global political summit.
Okay. Perhaps that is where the truth should actually come out. Stay with me, gentlemen. We will continue talking about this in greater detail. I have to slip into a quick break at this stage. But the fact remains, here is a situation where a big country like China that's bullying a small country like Bhutan is actually playing victim despite being the bully here. We'll talk about that. We will expose the truth here.